The transformation of charity to legal entitlement has produced donors without love and recipients without gratitude. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today I have Clint of Liberty Lockdown. Clint, where is the best place to find your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Liberty Lock Pod and YouTube, Liberty Lockdown, iTunes, Spotify, Liberty Lockdown, wherever you want.
All those links will be in the description. Clint, what convinced you to be a libertarian?
Well, I'm an oddball in that I'm a second-gen libertarian. My dad actually was one of the early adopters. He discovered it at some point in the 1970s, and then as I was being raised, even though I wasn't raised by him, I was raised by my mom and my stepdad. I would spend 1 week in a month with him, and we would do these long car rides out to his nightclub, and it was 4 hours each way. So I got plenty of indoctrination as to libertarian principles, and I just kind of carried on that torch, I guess.
Were there any specific things that this gentleman told you that really that struck a nerve, that really made you consider something you otherwise would have dismissed?
Honestly, because I was so young, I don't know that I can say that. You know, as a kid, you kind of just get fed stuff, and then things that make sense you internalize, and then other things you don't. So for whatever reason, it spoke to me. I was a very independent, rebellious kid. So I guess that side of things really appealed to me. The fact that, the founding of this country was based off of rebellion, and it certainly appealed to me in that light. And then I think that just it was logically congruent. It's like, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. I was like, okay, well, these are things I'm being told in kindergarten, and now my dad's telling me more of the underlying why, and it just stuck.
So much of it is it's so complex yet so simple. So it can be as complex as reading Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard, 1,400 pages, or it could also be remember what you learned in kindergarten. Yeah, it applies to that group called the Congress group. All right, we're pretty much done here. We've ended the 6,000-year death cult. What do you think is the reason that this blatant double standard, or how is this blatant double standard able to survive convincing so many people for so long?
Well, I'm sorry, which double standard?
The double standard of it's wrong for me to hit and steal, but when this group does it, it's called war and conscription and taxation. So totally different. Doesn't count.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an abdication of personal responsibility and a belief that there are people that are better than you and have the right to do things that you don't or won't do. And I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it just makes sense. There are problems across the globe, and we can't deal with all of them. So we think to ourselves, well, how can we help? Well, I pay taxes. My government can go and do these things. Now, naturally, that doesn't end up usually assisting people. In fact, it usually hurts them terribly. But I think that it makes sense. I don't want to portray it as people that believe in statism as being inherently evil. I don't think that they are, but I think that they are misguided deeply.
Yes. What would your elevator pitch be to someone on the right who sort of sees the state as sort of a neutral tool that could very often be used to promote the well-being of society, maybe make sure there are laws in place to stop degeneracy and promote things like the family? How would you communicate to someone with that mindset?
Well, my pitch has changed dramatically over the past 12 months. Given what transpired with lockdowns, I think that you don't need to go into historical analogies and things like that to really drive home the point. You just have to say, who was it that closed down your church? Who was it that closed down your business? Who was it that got you fired from your job or put you out of work for an extended period of time? Who put you on the dole even though you're avidly against the welfare state? I mean, I think that it was driven home in a way that was so succinct and so easy to explain that many conservatives came around on their own, which I'm grateful to see, and it seems as if many of them are having an enlightenment, so to speak, as to the negative ramifications of the state. Now, granted, there are still plenty out there that will see someone like the guy in Minnesota who got shot yesterday and justify it and find excuses for it, or say he's a career criminal and blah, blah, blah. So our work is not done. I don't want to overstate it by any means. There is still much work to be done when it comes to conservatives and Republicans in kind of getting them to see our worldview. But I think given the tyranny that we now exist under, even the most diehard Republican is starting to consider maybe this state is too big. Maybe this entire premise that we should be giving them a monopoly on violence is flawed. And thank God, because we need them to come around quickly.
Do you remember where you were, or were you just pretty much your first political ideology was libertarianism? Oh, were you anywhere before that?
I would say that the only shift I had is after 9/11. I certainly got more right wing. I got more concerned with terrorism and things like that. I mean, we were just traumatized with propaganda after 9/11, and some of your audience is probably too young to remember, but let me tell you, it was rough. You had color-coded schemes that were on the news every day. It was yellow or orange or red based off of the amount of alleged terrorist threat, based off of murmurs in the underbelly of our CIA or whatever, and they just absolutely terrorized us for months and years, really, and it was horrifying. So in that moment, not to mention I had an inherent reflexive response to say, I want to punish the people that killed 3,000 of my countrymen. I'm not a nationalist, but I still very much am concerned with the people in my area, and the fact that 3,000 of them were murdered for no reason really bothered me. So I'd say after that period, I wouldn't say I was pro-intervention by any stretch, but I certainly was interested in recompense, like trying to get payback for those people. I didn't support the war in Iraq, but I did support going after whoever was specifically responsible. And I'd say that was probably as much of a status as I've ever been. And I quickly learned the lesson that trusting in the government to go and get payback for us is also a fool's errand. And it resulted in the loss of freedoms and the loss of life in a way that I couldn't have possibly imagined. So I'll never make that mistake again.
It's amazing that even with the Afghan war, that's supposed to be the good one. Well, after all this
Right.
time, the Taliban is still calling the shots there. And Al-Qaeda has gone from 400 guys in 2001 to tens of thousands across multiple continents. Iraq was more or less taken over by Al-Qaeda and Zarqawi's guys in around 2003, 2004, after Saddam was overthrown. They sided with Al-Qaeda in Syria, sided with Al-Qaeda in Libya against Gaddafi, and took Al-Qaeda's side in Yemen. So, I mean, they screwed up a response to 9/11. Like, it should be, that was so bad that almost anything you do couldn't make it worse, but they empowered the very people that they pinned it on. And of course, the investigation was incredibly weak.
Yeah, well, not only did they support Al-Qaeda, but they armed them, particularly in Syria. And we continue to do that to this day, which is the crazy part. So yeah, I'll never support interventionism again. I think that it ultimately, whatever human desire I have for bloodlust is misguided when it comes to enabling the state to enforce that emotion. Ultimately, it ends up damaging us far more than it damages anybody else. I mean, well, I shouldn't say anybody else. Certainly, there's millions of people that die because of the bloodlust that Americans had in that moment. But in terms of our freedoms, you've lost those 3,000 people. They're not coming back. You give up your freedoms to pursue the people that are responsible, allegedly. Those freedoms aren't coming back. Like, it just in every possible way, it worsens the situation. And ultimately, our intervention is the reason we had 9/11 in the first place. So like, you have to take it all the way back to really understand the root cause of these things. And I, for one, will never participate in the propaganda push to support intervention in the future. It's just a fool's errand, truly.
What is your elevator pitch to people on the left who say that there was sort of a Wild West lack of regulation to the natural order? What we need is a state to usher in justice on behalf of the proletariat, women, blacks, people who are have a lower status and unfortunately not as much institutional power. How would you communicate the message of freedom to them?
Well, I would say that we have the largest state in human history, and yet we still see black men murdered by the enforcement arm of the state every year, every month, basically. So do you really want to empower that system, that mechanism? Can you reflect on the efficacy of the state that you support? Can you decide for yourself that perhaps we are not benefited to propagate and perpetuate this cycle, and maybe we should reconsider having such a strong central government as opposed to the alternative? It's a tough argument, but I think that if you can appeal to them based off of their alleged greater morality and sense of humanity when it comes to looking after the poor and things like that, or minorities, which is their latest siren call, and just demonstrate that despite all of these government programs, it hasn't benefited these very people that they claim to want to help. Ultimately, their claim will just be, oh, it just needs to be done better. It just needs to be done bigger. And and it's a very hard argument, but I think that's been the most fruitful one for me.
Yeah, I am always surprised when they say, this is, the most evil thing. Look at this video. This cop was totally unjustified. And I go, oh, definitely. Good call in pointing that out. You think we should have the right to opt out of funding them? No, we shouldn't. If you don't chip in for this organization, they should come to your house and put you in jail and separate you from your family and shoot you if you resist. It's like, what happened to you? We were friends 5 seconds ago.
That's a good point. I mean, all you can do is point it out to them. Ultimately, some of these people are unbreakably entrenched in their own belief system, but I think that more and more people are starting to understand, and we just have to kind of grease the tracks to hopefully get them all the way there.
Exactly. Yeah. From now on, I guess I'll just go to, oh, it's okay to force people to fund education. So Liberty Lockdown provides a lot of education. So you should therefore be forced to fund Clint. And if you don't like it, you should have the right to send him letters and petition him. But you still have to fund him. You can, the free market has the best regulation that anyone could ask for: the freedom of disassociation with bad actors or people you just don't like. So for all this call about we need to regulate this and that, well, then you should certainly support the free market. Very often people will say that they just have a fear of society that the state sort of curbs. So I'm terrified of the bad guys. Let's usher in the state. I'm terrified of just the virus. I'm terrified of my neighbors. I'm terrified of foreign criminals, not just domestic. When dealing with someone who has that fear, do you even approach it from a political side, or do you just try and get really at the heart of something else that might be resulting in this belief?
Give me another example of what you're talking about specifically.
So if someone says, I am so terrified of, let's just say, drug users, therefore I support not only the drug war, but a large state in general. Is that person really terrified of drugs, or are they just clinging to an irrational belief that they wouldn't have if they were friends with a drug addict who got clean and is now fine?
Yeah, I think it's important to try and get to the root of their actual position and their actual emotion behind it, because like when I debated Kevin Castley, I got to dig in and realize that a lot of his support for the war on drugs was because of his father's drug addiction. So I think that when you understand the more humanistic and the more emotional side of someone, of your ideological opponent, it makes it much easier to counter it. If you're supporting the war on drugs, for instance, for moral reasons, then I would argue against the morality of it. I would argue that it's essentially enslaving someone who hasn't hurt anybody. Is that okay? Ask that question. If it's someone who's lost a family member to drug addiction, you have to ask them, did the war on drugs assist them in any way? Did it actually benefit the situation? Is it going to bring them back? How many lives is it sacrificing to try and bring back that person that you're missing so deeply? I think that it's important not to just assume that because they have the wrong opinion, which I believe they have the wrong opinion, that they have it for the wrong reason. Oftentimes they have it for a decent reason. But if you can figure out that root cause, it makes it much easier to attack the issue and to try and find common ground and try and, I don't want to say evolve them past it, but that's essentially what I'm trying to do, is to evolve them past this base instinct for punishment, when in fact the drug addict is oftentimes a victim. Not always, certainly, but if they're a peaceful person who was abused as a kid, who end up being a drug addict, it's like, do you want to put them in prison for the rest of their life if they haven't hurt anybody? Like, just make. I really do believe that the emotional argument against the war on drugs is the most powerful, because oftentimes they're using emotion. They're saying, this person is a danger to society, and I'm like, okay, well, how are they a danger if they haven't hurt anybody? Well, they could be. They could steal to get money for drugs. Well, did they? No, they didn't. So, like, we're still opposed to theft and murder and violence. It's like, so we can find a common ground here. But if the person is just a weekend warrior who does cocaine and gets caught and gets put in prison for 10 years, is that okay? Do you really think that that's just? Does that benefit society? And oftentimes I think that you can find common ground. Even with Kevin, it seemed as if I swayed him a little bit, and I didn't expect that. But I think if you come at it with a sense of love and compassion, it oftentimes is reflected in your opponent in this situation, which he clearly was.
And it certainly humanizes our side.
Yes, and oftentimes libertarians are not very humanistic in our arguments. We will be very mechanistic and materialistic, and we just try and like dollars and cents people into our belief system, as opposed to giving the emotionally compelling argument for why we're right. And obviously, like, we're not prone to emotion very much. Like, many of us are on the spectrum, and we try and like give it very cut and dry. But I think that oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with people that aren't very politically inclined, it's beneficial to attack them, from their heart and work from there.
They've got some nerve saying drug addicts are a threat to society as they advocate the U.S. government kidnapping people by the millions, caging them for victimless crimes, murdering innocent people, caging the whistleblowers while giving the people who committed the murder medals and parades. Please, of all the people to have that. So what I said to Kevin was, Kevin said, you don't really think that drugs are a victimless crime. And I said, well, yes, I'm defining a victim as someone whose rights are violated, a right being any action that's morally justified insofar as you're not initiating violence or fraud against a peaceful person. So even though it may hurt you, that doesn't justify caging that person. And I just use my dad as an example, who is, very open about his drug use, and now he's been clean for 14 years. As bad as, let me tell you, it was not easy when he would use, but it at least didn't lead to him getting put in jail, where he'd be friends with more criminals instead of having some network. He wouldn't have been able to pay child support, so my mom would have been worse off. It would have made it a lot harder for him to get a job once he got out of prison, as opposed to the good position he has now. And when you're in jail, it's kind of boring, so people end up using more drugs. They can't keep drugs out of prisons, and they're telling me that they're protecting the border and all this nonsense. So yeah, even opening up to them on their own terms, I see so often as a way to communicate. Another way, I was at the Trump rally, and Hispanics for Trump was there, and they were the most energetic people I've ever seen. They were like, President Trump, please get reelected, and they were just so into it. And I almost felt that it was a crisis of meaning, because Trump didn't even like start his own, or he didn't even go to Parler and say, I'm competing with Twitter now that they took me down. Like, he didn't give them anything. He didn't cut spending. He didn't end any big government industries. He really just, so if that's where they're finding their meaning, I'm sorry, it's a little weak to do so. Do you see there is a crisis of meaning in our opponents, and see ways that we could assist them on that level rather than just bringing politics into it immediately?
A crisis of meaning. Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people have a decent amount of principles behind their belief systems. It's just that if you're speaking specifically to the conservatives, I think that they are rudderless right now, and I've reached out to them more aggressively than I have the left, because obviously they're out of power now, and Trump abandoned them, and Trump essentially threw them under the bus when it came to the January 6th event. So I think that many of them, especially those that deified Trump, that now feel as if they were abandoned by him, especially those that were Q followers that believe that, he was going to get put back in power, and like there was no way, and all these pedophiles were going to be arrested and rounded up and blah, blah, blah. And Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were going to be in Gitmo. I genuinely received that text from my aunt. Couldn't believe it. Those people are truly rudderless. I mean, they are just floating in a sea of emotion and misery right now. So I certainly do want to reach out to them, try and give them purpose, in the sense that I think that their root belief system is still one based in freedom, even though that they have fallen prey to, the idealism of statism and idolatry of Trump. I still think that the message that they supported Trump on was largely one of freedom and capitalism, even though he didn't propel either of those ideals. So I'm trying to reinstill that spirit and realize that, they are up against a truly tyrannical state. And I try not to juxtapose it with Trump very much, because ultimately it's irrelevant. He's gone. We have to deal with the now, and the now is very, very bad. So I'm trying to inspire them to, even if I have to put it in Trump terms, carry on his legacy of fighting against the mainstream media and all that, give them that spirit and that emotion, because ultimately the libertarians are way outnumbered. I mean, we don't have a chance of fighting this state if we don't have people that stand beside us. And I believe it's that dire. I believe that it really is. So I am open to allying with people that I normally would not, simply because I realize that the situation is very grim. And if we don't meaningfully push back now, it's over. And I think that many of them get that, even if they don't get it for the same reasons you and I probably do. So I don't know if I have to inspire that spirit in them, but I have to kind of rebuild their belief in themselves, as opposed to believing in a supreme leader that can save them.
Excellent point there. As far as I just came off Twitter not too long ago, so I was a little heated. I didn't mean to say our enemies, as in all non-libertarians are, an enemy that we have to defeat. As far as people who are not on the same page with us, do not see the world as we do, do you think we're up against people who are immoral and have different values, or simply people who have been tricked, who really do have good values?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, very few people, in my belief, are actually evil. I don't think that the majority, most people believe that they are the hero of their own story. They think that they are propagating good in the world. Even those that, Kevin Castley, the neoconservative, he believes that he's good. He believes that he's spreading freedom and democracy across the globe. I genuinely believe he thinks that. And now ultimately he supports some of the greatest evils of our lifetimes. So call him a useful idiot, call him whatever you will. But I think that most people are coming from a place of borderline altruism. Obviously, a lot of selfish drives in there, mixed in there as well. So I wouldn't say that the majority of our ideological opponents are evil, but I think that ultimately, when you have an entire society structured around 12 years of public education and then 4 years of severe Marxist indoctrination when they go to university, it's like, what did you expect? Did you expect? I mean, these people aren't born evil, but they spend their entire lives being taught it. So I have sympathy for that. I can't help but have sympathy for that. I went through it, and because of my upbringing, because of my parents, including my other parents, not just my dad, I was taught to have a mistrust of authority and to have a sense of independence, a fierce sense of independence, and most people weren't. So, that's been my premise of my show, is to try and instill kind of a fiery passion for entrepreneurialism and independence and kind of a revolutionary spirit. And I think that it's found a lot of ears. I think that there's people out there that are waking up every single day realizing how lied they've been to, or how lied they've been to. Sure.
Yeah, it's rough when Kevin was defending the FBI to me with regard to the Waco situation. I go,
man.
My gosh, it's one of those. The reason Waco's so big is that, like, I mean, imagine there's a mass shooting, and instead of the nation mourning, they half or 80% of the country just defends the murderers. That's how bad the Waco situation is. And then they know who the mass shooters are, and then they don't put them to jail. It would be like that. And then these people are, one of them was just promoted to the head of the ATF under Biden. I think that's the same guy, David Thibodeau, who was a Branch Davidian, mentioned it on his Facebook feed. He said, yeah, this is the guy who was there on what's referred to as Day 51. But gosh, some of those things, they just can't imagine that their government would do something like this, even when it's right in front of their eyes. It's like talking to a little child who's like, my parents have never done a bad thing. They've never said a bad word or anything else. Or, parents hearing about their kid in high school. My son doesn't drink alcohol. He knows what the law is. It's like, it's just so sad and naive.
Well, they believed that the Waco folks were sieged for, I think it was like 2 months. And then they decided in unison to commit suicide.
At the very second that the FBI came in with tanks and spraying CS gas known to cause fires, and on day one they defended themselves. A suicide cult defended themselves with guns. That's pretty crazy, man.
It's a fascinating thesis.
Kevin is so much smarter than you and I. We can't even understand how legitimate the FBI is.
It's really horrifying. But I watched the who was the guy that it was James Corbett. He got kicked off of YouTube. He was on Thaddeus Russell's show yesterday, and he was talking about the brilliance of allowing disclosure of CIA and FBI operations 50 years after the fact, because it allows the government to come out and say, see, we are honest with you. So now you know what we've done. So please don't question what we're doing now, as opposed to the logical step of going, holy shit, look at all this evil stuff they've done. I wonder what they're doing today. But people like Kevin can look at that and go, they disclosed it. We know what they did in the past. We've evolved. The government's better now. Like, they wouldn't do any of this stuff. So it's an interesting dichotomy in the headspace of people. It's like we see that as evidence that likely what's transpiring behind the curtain today is equally evil, if not more so, and others see it as, well, they've paid their penance. They told us what's up, even though no one even pays a price, because it's 50 years after the fact, and all the people that were participants in it are dead. It's a pretty sinister plot there.
It's wild, yeah. And you'll get this thing where it'll be like, in 2003, you're a dumb conspiracy theorist if you think the government just spies on everyone. And then Stellar Wind and Prism come out, and it appears that Edward Snowden and William Benny are accurately telling us that the NSA spies on everyone. And they go, well, of course that happens. They have to do that for our safety. It's like they both say it's impossible, and then when you prove that it's happening, they go, oh, well, yeah, it'll happen. It's like, Unless the name of the law is the "We are the government here to instill tyranny for bad motives" law, that it's going to trick them. It's going to be the Patriot Act. It's going to be Affordable Care Act. It's going to be something that sounds nice in order to trick people. Do you
That's how
notice how
dense
often
people
you?
are.
Yeah. Do you notice how euphemisms are so commonly used? Shouldn't we fund X? And by fund X, I mean cage everyone who doesn't chip in. Do you see how euphemisms are almost like the entire power of the state?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a very powerful mechanism because it always all they have to do is make an emotional appeal. Like, do you want to alleviate childhood poverty? It's like, of course I do. Fucking, what do you think I am, a monster? Um, but I also don't want to imprison people that don't want to participate. And I also don't believe that the funds that you're stealing from me are going to be utilized for those ends. And I have a litany of historical examples to demonstrate definitively that you are lying, that it will not alleviate childhood poverty, no matter how fucking beautifully you say it. So yeah, I mean, they are masters at it. They have truly mastered the information war. I mean, they really, Alex Jones has that right. It is a information war, and we are on the losing end of it at this point. Fortunately, there's fringe outlets like you and I that are out there, trying to get the truth to the people. But it's a uphill battle. I mean, we have both the government in opposition to us, and now we have these quasi-private organizations like, I don't even know if we're put on there, so I won't say it, but the tech boys, that are also trying to suppress us and also work hand in hand with the government to ban people like you and I. So it's an uphill battle, man. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, since, J.P. Morgan and his pals were writing the Federal Reserve in 1910, it's always been big business and big government, working hand in hand. It's a symbiotic relationship. That was another red pill, because you'd think it's like we have business and they're up against government and they're always fighting. And then you realize that they're like all best friends, like Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. It's like there's so much overlap between these organizations.
Oh, it's like, if you actually look at the history of this country and you don't come away as a massive conspiracy theorist, I don't know what you're looking at. Like, because it is just, our entire history is that of conspiracy, of conspiring between private business and government to strip us of our rights, our money, everything you can imagine. And it's like, it's funny because as many libertarians, our knee-jerk reaction is to defend business. But I think that it's very important that there is a delineation in our belief where we say, yes, we support small business and we support capitalism and entrepreneurialism and anybody who's doing it the right way. We don't support those that are in bed with government, that are basically being granted monopolies as payment for removing more and more of our freedoms. Like, that's an important line, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to explain the distinction. And yet there are many libertarians that struggle with it. And if we can't get the libertarians on the same page, how the fuck are we going to get the rest of the world on the same page? Like, it's an uphill battle. So that's what I'm working on.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, people again are just used to sort of knee-jerk words like business is good because they provide things and we exchange it for money. It's like, well, no, that's not what justifies it. Government provides things in exchange for money, but it's the involuntariness that makes
There
it
you
bad.
go.
So when business is working with the state, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Chase Manhattan Bank, well, it's not the business that makes them legitimate. What would make them legitimate is freedom of association and disassociation. So you don't
Yes.
get to bail them out when they go bad. It's profit and loss.
Well, and
Yeah,
not just the military industrial complex and not just big banks, but big tech. I mean,
exactly.
they
Yeah.
absolutely have agreements and arrangements with the NSA and the CIA to spy on us. If you think otherwise, you are impossibly delusional. I mean, it's so clear. So that's been the latest fight. I think that it's the most important one because that is the main line of the information war is big tech. I mean, that is where we're allowed to talk to our people. And if we are driven into smaller and smaller corridors for bigger and bigger businesses that are deeper and deeper in bed with the government, I think we all know where this goes. I mean, you're going to have, fortunately, I think they're overplaying their hands, and you have spin-offs like Odyssey and whatnot that are popping up that are trying to compete genuinely. But you got to understand, the deck is so incredibly stacked against them because they have these arrangements with the government, and they are pushing for increasing regulation on their own industry. And if you think that's to prevent them from doing bad things, you're out of your mind. It's to prevent competition, as it always has been. So it's we need people to wake up on this issue very quickly, because it's near the end, 23rd hour.
Exactly. I caught a great comedy bit. I forget who it was, but he said, when I was younger, I thought quicksand would be a much bigger deal than it actually is in the real world, because like every show involved someone dying of quicksand falling. And
True.
and he goes, well, that just didn't happen. That's not an accurate portrayal. And it made me think that it was never that someone said, came on the TV and said, kids, you're very likely to fall into quicksand. Here are statistics on how likely you are to fall into quicksand. It's very high. All they did was repeat it. They just used repetition to build it into our minds. So it was just the way the world worked. We never questioned it until we sort of saw further. Do you see how repetition, cases are up, there was a shooting, how repetition is used to increase not only power of the state, but the legitimacy of the state in the minds of the populace?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, it's not as if gun violence is new in this country. I mean, we have had shootings and death and murders as long as we've existed. We are a well-armed populace. So that's going to happen. But I think that the propagation of constant bombardment of stories about gun violence is, in my view, obviously being utilized to push for gun control. And as someone who believes that our right to self-defense is absolutely sacrosanct, like it's the most important thing, and they want to remove it. And after we've been locked in our houses for a year, that is the last thing we should ever consider. So yeah, they are tremendously good at overemphasizing the amount of fear that we should have over, relatively rare incidents. And they do it with gun violence. They do it with COVID. They do it with white supremacy and white nationalist violence, which is is the constant fear mongering. I mean, there are people that genuinely believe that they exist in a white supremacist culture with genuine KKK white hood wearing Nazis that are out there killing people every weekend. It's completely fictitious. It's not real, but it doesn't matter because the media has told these people this week after week, year after year, and now they believe it. They believe that Trump was a Nazi. Like, he was a terrible president, but he wasn't a Nazi. I mean, like, I'm sorry. So, yeah, their repetitiveness and their capacity for it and their willingness to drive it home infinitely is extraordinarily powerful. Even people that are relatively rational, people that are relatively good people, fall prey to it. And yeah, that's a tough one, man. I don't know how we break that cycle.
I wonder, this seems so naive, but just to ask them, when was the homicide rate in America at its highest? Because it was higher in the 90s and the 80s than it is now. And it's like, well, why are we hearing about it so much more? Well, you hear about it, and then you think it's that much more common than it otherwise would be. I mean, they were pimping the ozone layer for so long as that was going to be something terrible, or overpopulation, or Saddam's getting WMDs, or ISIS, or Al Qaeda,
or global cooling.
Every time there's a terrible thing, the shocking solution is to give the mass murdering state more power. Every single time it's the same solution.
Yeah, and it's not an accident. I think that's the biggest thing that that's the next level of red pill is like, at first you realize perhaps I'm being lied to, but it's probably unintentional. And then you realize, oh, perhaps I'm being lied to and it's extremely intentional. And I think that's the level that I'm at, where it's like, yeah, clearly they are pushing the gun violence issue, and including that, even though I am very much opposed to police violence, they are pushing every time there is police violence, particularly against a minority, because there are incidences of police murder of white people, and it gets zero coverage. So
Goose egg. Yeah.
so when you realize that they are only pushing it when it comes to particularly black people, I mean, even if it's Hispanic, they won't push it as hard. But if it's black, my God, they are going to make that full court press 24/7 for weeks on end. And I think that they are attempting to foment racial division. I don't think that it's about defunding the police or police reform in any serious fashion as much as it is sowing discord in this country. And it's in my view, it's a very clear and brazen Marxist tactic to divide and conquer us. And I don't know who's the man behind the curtain, but to me it's clear as day, because if you look at the statistics of police violence and the police shootings and killings of American people, it's pretty static. It's like 1,000 every year for decades. So, this is not a new situation. And yet we feel as if, or at least the black community feels as if, they're under siege in a way that they never have been before. Whereas it is, in fact, a historical truth that they have been under siege for a very long time. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't alleviate these issues and we shouldn't have police reform. Very much, I do believe that we should. But when it's portrayed as strictly a white on black cop versus minority violence issue, I think it's a huge mistake, and it's not meant to alleviate the issue. In fact, it's rather to increase the divide amongst the people here, which is tragic.
Yeah, it totally misses the principled foundation that these group of people claim the right to rule. Everyone else, you don't obey them, they get to shoot you. I mean, it's like in their own rules. If you don't, that is the heart of the issue. So yeah, all those things totally missed the boat, unfortunately. We got about 15 minutes left here. I just want to go over some of the people you and I spoke about previously. What is the most important thing you learned from the work of Jordan B. Peterson?
Oddly, I think that it's probably his religious studies or sermons or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I think that his explanations of the hero's journey and of allegory and biblical stories and how they've had such lasting impact on society over eons has been really beneficial to me, as someone who is not religious. It has explained more of the beauty and the power of religion in a way that I hadn't really given credence. So I think that to me has been really impactful. And then also I really support his drive to get young men in particular to concern themselves with improving themselves. And I think that's a really important message that somehow was lost in the past few decades. And I think that's why he's been so successful and so popular, is because ultimately young men in particular, when they haven't heard that message that they are capable and that they should, it's very powerful and it's eye-opening. And as someone who's been very successful and had great parenting that taught me those lessons, I was just thrilled to see someone like him out there giving that message to these people that were so clearly lost. I mean, you see these young men that are in tears watching his speeches, and it's like, it's just beautiful. So I'm devastated to see what an emotional and spiritual toll it's taken on him. But I think that his sacrifice has been worthwhile. So I'm very grateful.
Yes, definitely. I thought he did a great job in pointing out what's referred to as the Pareto principle, also the iron law of oligarchy, where when human beings exist, what they do is they act, and in doing so, they try to achieve a goal. Some people are going to be better at achieving that goal than others, and you immediately have a hierarchy. So the existence of hierarchies is not anything arbitrary or anything that should even be hated. It's good that in a crowd of there's 50,000 people in a stadium and only Adele is singing. Everyone else is very quiet. 1 out of 50. That's not even close to 1%. That's
Right.
so unequal. And guess what? It's also okay. So this
And it's a woman.
inequality. I didn't even, and it's a foreigner.
Yeah.
Yes, double
Yeah.
points.
I think and I mean there's so much beauty in his message. I can't even like encapsulate it all, but you're absolutely right. His defense of natural hierarchy has been very important, particularly for those that believe in capitalism, as I do. So yeah, he's just a very important messenger for this time.
And let's see. There was one thing I wrote down from Peterson. It was compare yourself to who you were yesterday. So often we can become insecure while looking at all of the great people we run into online, or not even run into, we just hear about or see. But a much better grasp of whether or not you're improving or diminishing in qualities, comparing yourself to you yesterday, not someone who you know nothing about. You don't know how they were raised. You don't know if what they're showing you on their Instagram story is an accurate representation or a selective representation. So of course, yeah, there's so much wisdom in his message. Any final thoughts on him?
No, I think that for someone like me who was given that belief system from an early age and who has overachieved and probably achieved more than I could have imagined even, it's I still find tremendous drive and motivation from comparing myself to people that aren't me, to people that are better than me.
Yeah.
But if you're coming from a point of fragility and self-doubt, perhaps it is better to compare yourself to yourself from yesterday as opposed to, I don't know, Elon Musk or someone who's just killing it. Like you got to decide. But if you're surrounded by peers that are all falling apart, then perhaps you just need to get better day after day and build yourself a foundation from which you can really catapult yourself. So I think that his entire messaging on that topic has been very powerful and just deeply beneficial to particularly young men, even though it can be appealing to women at times as well.
Most important thing you learn from the work of Murray and Rothbard?
Oh my God, so much. I mean, for me, it was really my conversion from libertarianism into anarchism or anarcho-capitalism. So I think that'll be his legacy for me. For everybody else, it can be different. I just think that in terms of a concise annihilation of statism, you can't do better than Murray Rothbard. I mean, he is just a killer. And Anatomy of the State is one of the quickest, easiest reads of any libertarian or anarcho-capitalist or anarchist writing that you can hand to somebody and say, in 2 hours, you will completely change your view on governance and the world. Like, it's so concise and so powerful. So that's for me, that's been the impact of Rothbard.
Excellent pick with Anatomy of the State. Brief, to the point. You can get people to read it, whereas For a New Liberty is a little rough to get them to hand them.
I just started it actually, so
yeah. Well, even for us, it's hard to get through.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite a bit. Most important thing you learned from or contribution of Tim Ferriss?
Well, Tim Ferriss actually had a very deep impact on my life. His 4-Hour Workweek book I read in 2010, I believe, and maybe it was 11 or 12, but it was about a decade ago, and it completely changed my life. I had been working for my family business at the time, and I decided after reading that to start my own company and to become, financially free and to limit my amount of work and to value personal growth and to value health and happiness over financial gain, which is something that I did not have built into me at the time. I was very much like, I have to reach these financial goals. That was all I was interested in. And I was doing it to the detriment of being a well-rounded person. So his lessons on how to formulate passive income and things of that nature even though that was already built into me from my dad in particular, and I had already had a decent amount of passive income, his message on it, that you could do it and why are you doing it and how can you do it to expedite and increase the happiness of your life, man, that was impactful on me. And it totally changed my life. I genuinely went from a middle of the road 50 to 60K a year type employee to essentially retired in a decade. And I credit a tremendous amount of that to him inspiring me to take that path. I mean, I think it was already in me, but that lit the fire.
Excellent. I saw this quote from him I thought was great. It said, "A person's success in life can usually be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have." I have thought about that for so long because I feel like there's a lot of wisdom. And, well, the if someone is willing to have an uncomfortable conversation, that at least shows they're a little open-minded. They're a little open to saying I was wrong. They're more open to improvement as a causal result of that. They'll see more options and a wider range of opinions, and have more experiences just because they are open-minded. So I saw that. I love those little quotes that really communicate an important message.
And it also means that you're not suffering, because oftentimes people are unwilling to have difficult conversations because they're beating themselves up over other things. And it's like, I'm speaking more in terms of relationships now. But if you're coming from a healthy, happy place, you're oftentimes much more open to having difficult conversations because you're not dealing with so much internal turmoil already. Oftentimes, someone with a static belief system is someone who's really internally damaged and not addressing it, in my experience. So I think that it's a sign of internal strength and health if you're able to have those conversations that challenge you and rip open another layer of your being. And Tim Ferriss has been great in helping me do that.
Two more questions for you. Thank you, Clint, for being generous with your time. Most important thing you learned from the works of George Orwell?
Well, he told us what the future would be. he told us what our present is.
A real psychic, finally.
Yeah, he told us what our present is. I mean, I just think with 1984, it's like, man, what an unbelievable warning to society across the globe. And for me, that's his legacy to me, is that it demonstrated that the dystopic future or present that we currently exist in was predictable, and in fact it was predicted. And it doesn't take a genius to extrapolate from here to see where it likely leads next. And I think that's why people like myself and I don't know if I've seen you make the comparison, but I know Libertarian of Kentucky party, they got destroyed for it. But I think that when you start to see the pattern, you can almost see the future. Like it's very close to seeing the future, because for the past year I've looked like a psychic simply because I understand the growth of the state and the increasing creep of tyranny. And so I can say, hey, this is happening today. A few months from now, this is likely to happen. And people are like, holy shit, how'd you know? And I'm like, because I just know. This is the pattern. This is what happens. And Orwell obviously had a tremendous gift of that, and he extrapolated in a much grander scale. He went, 50 years into the future. So yeah, that's his legacy to me.
Well, yeah, there's an actual study. I think it's called ponerology, where it's the study of, God, I hope that's not something else that I'm way off on, but it's about studying psychopathic behavior. So just as if you're a therapist who has done a lot of research into abusive spouses, well, you can see some of the early signs, some of the red flags, and you could see how things escalate to the point where you're able to predict a number of things that you might think, well, how do you know that? You must be, do you have my phone tapped or something? You go, no, that these are just the characteristics of people who like to control people. Now, those are small scale criminals. A little bigger scale, you get your local mafia, Bloods and Crips. Biggest scale, bankers, politicians, big tech. Those are the ones who really do it. So yeah, it's the same study of psychopathy.
Yeah. And I think that also because of my profession of evaluating risk, I was and kind of still am a mortgage broker, private money mortgage broker. So my job was to evaluate risk and threats and macroeconomic forces paired with microeconomic forces and decide, is this investment valid? Is it sound? So I think that enables me to do risk assessment when it comes to other areas. and the government is the greatest risk to us. So it's just a natural progression.
Finally, what is the most important thing you learned from the work of Robert Heinlein? That's his first name, right? Heinlein?
Yeah, I always just call him Heinlein, but I think it's Robert Heinlein. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
To me, the moon is a harsh mistress is one of his greatest works, and that one had the most impact on me. It's been a long time since I read it, to be honest, but it was very formative. I read it in my early 20s, and it was the first time I had seen libertarian fiction, even though he may not be a libertarian, but it has a very, very striking libertarian message in it. So I would recommend everybody check that out. It also popularized the term "there ain't no such thing as a free lunch," and that was kind of like a pretty damning argument against the welfare state and government and taxation and things like that. Believing that you can print money. It's also an argument against inflation. Like, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Like, you can't fucking do this. It will not work out long term. So I think that his work was, whether intentionally or unintentionally, a very libertarian and a very formative part of my life.
The show is Liberty Lockdown. Find the links in the description below. Clint, thank you so much for your time. It's good meeting you, man.
It was a pleasure.